Leah Briick, Executive Director for SASH, and we're here for another conversation from the couch again today. Today, my guest is Dr. Chapple-Love. Welcome. We're so glad that you could join us today. Today, we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Called you for a special conversation to have with me today. But before we do that, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your practice and what you're doing?
Sure, absolutely. I appreciate the invite, Leah. I'm happy to help. I am Chapple-Love. I'm a licensed psychologist out of Nevada, which means that it's almost November and we still have our air conditioners on out here. Like I said, I'm a licensed psychologist. I have my own private practice out here that's L Psychological Services. I do a lot in the Nevada community in our state with and for psychologists, really to be able to better serve the communities that we have out here, which is a very diverse population and populations just like all over the nation and everywhere else that deserve multicultural informed care and affirming care. So I tend to do a lot of training in that regard, consulting with other organizations and my clinical work as well. So that's why I'm here.
Well, and that's exactly why I called you this summer, and actually might have been a little bit past the summer, but it was as the Olympics were ending, and I was reading an article about an Olympic swimmer. She's a Black swimmer, Simone Manuel, and one of the reporters in the interview was asking her about inclusion, and her response was that why am I, as the Black swimmer, always being asked the question about how to be included or how people of color get included? And, as a white person, it really made me think, gosh, that's so true. Why am I leaving things to people of color to figure out? What am I doing? What am I doing as a white person to make sure that I am being inclusive, that I'm being equitable, and that I'm bringing diversity, especially to SASH, that I'm bringing diversity to SASH. So, I immediately thought of you because we've had you at the conference before, and certainly I know about your background. But I just, I thought, who can I go to? Who can I ask for help? And I thought it would be a great little discussion for us. So how do I start that? How do I ask for help from someone of color without being offensive, really, is what I want to know.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite phrases on therapy is there's a lot to unpack there, and I think we've already gotten there. There's literally a lot to unpack. I mean, to begin that, I think that word, offensive, or how do I not offend someone, comes out a lot. I put myself in this space. It's a very, autonomously driven and purposeful thing that I do, where I'm like, I want to be known as the lady that's out here doing like DE&I trainings and places like that. But I think it's worthwhile to consider, as a person who maybe is a part of a majority culture or a non-marginalized culture, certainly not global majority, but considered majority in this country. It's important to really consider what's the impact of my question. Is it the summer of 2020 and I'm looking on my phone at like Black bodies splattered across the pavement, and I'm asking my Black colleagues, like, my God, have you seen this? That's probably not a good time to do that, because what potentially could be the impact, certainly none of us can read the future, but being able to have certain reasonable assumptions about how something might impact. There's videos of police brutality. There's movies that I, as a Black woman, have chosen not to look at because I don't have that in me right now, because I've got, what we choose to deal with on a daily basis, and then how we help our patients and how we help this. And so I think part of that question is recognizing what's the impact, irrespective of my intent, right? So we talk a lot about impact over intent is one of the first things that comes to my mind there. Who is more heavily impacted or likely to be carrying so much more of the burden, explaining yet again why Black Lives Matter, or explaining how a lot of the changing optics have been impactful for them. And then there was that word offensive that we brought up earlier too. I think that's another kind of a knee-jerk reaction as these optics started shifting. First of all, racism, sexism, transphobia at all have not been invented in the summer of 2020. But what I think it did for a lot of folks that were in a place of privilege and, could kind of assume that, oh, it's just guys, down south, or it's just people back in the day that had these really awful views. And that was the significant impact for communities of color or communities that are marginalized. And then in 2020, it was everywhere. Banks were saying, oh, no, we have to acknowledge now that Black Lives Matter and things like that. And so with the shift in optics, I think people started having a reaction of, well, I don't want to end up on YouTube. I don't want to be in a Karen video on TikTok. And so how do I not offend people? And while it's good to be aware of there's consequences, natural or otherwise now, to my behavior if I choose to call the police on a person that's walking in a park or people who are playing their music too loud for no other reason than I'm trying to use the police as a punitive measure to get them to stop doing whatever behavior I deem to be annoying, that really it's also kind of created a space of I'm scared to ask questions now because I don't want to put myself out there in a way that might be harmful for someone. And so it's kind of a tightrope that we're all walking at this point.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's, you're talking about vulnerability and both of us being vulnerable. And I think when I called you to see if you were interested in having this conversation, I mean, I got real vulnerable with you and said, I'm afraid. And I think it's valid, but I also see it as my responsibility to make sure that I'm being inclusive. And so how do I do that without, how do I allow myself to be vulnerable, and where can I do that? And I think that's a really important question.
Yeah, I think that hits a lot of those different sides that we're all playing. We're talking about allyship here. How can I ally myself with this community, not being a member of it, and knowing that in a lot of ways, maybe I shouldn't be at the front of the pack leading the way. Part of that is, the question I'm hearing you ask is where and how can I do that? One of those is insight. Research is super duper clear on this, that, attending one DE&I training is not going to amount to a hill of beans. That one class that we all, you know what I mean? Like, no, this is
let's
weird.
go to our annual DEI training that we're required to have every year. And let's talk about diversity.
Now, this is like me having a terrible business model because I literally just said that I do DE&I trainings, and I tell people all the time, I'm like, I know that for you, this might feel like let's just do one and check it off a list, but research is super clear that that's not going to be enough. It is going to require ongoing trainings around different topics. Are you addressing ageism? Are you addressing sexism? Are you addressing ability level? Not just these ones that whatever pops up in the news this week. And also it requires an awful lot of internal work, which I think still feels probably kind of icky for us as therapists, even though I have an assumption or some should statements coming through my head right now that we should be the people leading the charge on internal work. But it's still hard. And I think it's hard in particular for white communities and cis communities and communities that are not, marginalized in some of these ways that other folks are, that there's a certain amount of fragility. And there's that word. And now we talk about people being triggered by words. So when I say white fragility, sometimes a person's brain shuts right off.
Right.
As opposed to doing the work to listen to the rest of the sentence. The rest of the sentence is white fragility is a pretty common response to not having had to build up the same defenses that someone who doesn't have the privilege to kind of, I can turn the TV off, or I can go in my home, not experience racism.
Right.
And we don't get to do that in Black communities and brown communities and Indigenous communities and things like that. So some of it is a lot of really hard internal work. Another piece is finding the resources. There's another presumption in our field, I think, that there's quite a large amount of privilege. So I'm coming from a place of privilege from saying this, but Google it. You have the same internet connection I do. We might be paying through different services, and maybe it's a little shoddy sometimes, but going to the library, there's amazing organizations out there. There's opportunities for people to learn, but it requires that you get up off the couch and get off your confirmation bias, I think, to do so, which is hard for people to hear, because I think it's a natural response to have some defensiveness there.
Well, and I think what's important in what you're saying is that, and it goes back to a little bit of what you said before, and that's not just going to all my friends who are of color and saying, hey, how,
why is critical race theory important?
Like, like, can you tell me about this? Like, and expecting you as a person of color to educate me. So the onus is on me to go out but I will say though that I have found that I'm not always really good my picker's not great. And in terms of books that I read and looking at, who's the author of that book. And so I've really had to broaden my spectrum in terms of where I'm going and who I'm reading.
And I love that too. We do a lot of talks in the business, I think, surrounding decolonizing psychology as a whole, from attacking some of these constructs that we have in our head. I know I've got a well ingrained, neural pathway for things like, the triangles and other, theories that were perpetrated by folks that were getting those ideas from indigenous peoples and other people of color. And so I think a lot of that work requires that we look at whose idea was this, who got famous for the idea, and how are we using it. A pretty common question I ask that kind of blows people's minds when I'm doing a training or a discussion with an organization is, name me the top 5 theorists that you all use in your practice right now. And then theories are irrespective here, but let's look at the identity factors of those folks. Are they all cis? Are they all Western? Were they all born within the last 100 years? Taking a look at all of these pieces is going to be one of the ways I think that'll help you improve that radar of like, okay, this might be a great book on the topic, Interpretation of Dreams. It's a classic. Been reading it since freshman year of college, but let's also look at how other cultures address this. And that's going to come through in your clinical practice as well, because if I have a Black client that is talking about, I've spoken with my grandmother last night in a dream, and my grandmother died in 1994, that isn't necessarily indicative of psychosis. We need to take a look at cultural perspectives there. So I think it comes out in all of our ultimate goals, the communities, but it starts with me pushing myself past what is readily available.
Right. Well, and I think that you and I have talked about this before in recognizing that is the person who's the loudest, is that the right voice? And who am I not hearing that maybe is getting suppressed because the other voice is louder?
And therein lies the piece about inclusion that I think we forget how hard it is. A big piece of my self-identity in this field is recognizing that I want to stand for people who have difficulty getting in the room. That's my job, matter of fact, to get in these rooms and use my elbows. I got little T-Rex arms, but I got elbows for days. And to make some room, like who else can we get in this room? Because that's how we have that wealth of knowledge and wealth of communication. And being able to recognize that, I also have a responsibility to not be the one at the front of the pack with the bullhorn in my hand at the advocacy event or the rally or what have you, because people don't need you to speak for them. They need you to speak with them. And that's hard. That's been hard for me. So, that's that self-work that I think we all have to do that not enough of us talk about.
Yeah, I think that is hard, especially for someone who is like me, that tends to be rather boisterous and in front. I mean, I just am really, and naturally, I just kind of take over leadership, when somebody else is not doing it for themselves. And that's a really good point, that perhaps I need to help them, mentor them into, all right, how can we help you to be out front instead of me being out front for you?
I feel you. I tend to have I'm like Shania Twain, let's go girls, gender inclusive. I'm there. I'm ready to kick the door off the hinge. But I that self-check that I just saw you do, that I just talked about me having to do as well. Like, maybe I just need to use my privilege, my ability to be loud, my ability to take a hit, my ability to do this, that, or the third, to stand beside or behind somebody else. Mm-hmm. Because perhaps my, whatever advanced degree privilege is going to help them get the voice that they need on this committee right now. And I think that there's amazing organizations doing this kind of work as far as the where, if we're going back to pragmatics from your first question. And that these organizations stand for things that are important within the communities that they serve. So,
tell me about some of those organizations.
Women of Color Sexual Health Network, Association of Black Sexologists and Clinicians, and other organizations. I'm gonna keep bugging you until SASH is on that list too, of being an organization that recognizes, let's look at our exec board, let's look at our people who are making decisions, and how are they different? What is the shift in ability level and age and perspective and cultural factors that make these places great. So that's the thing. And that to me is the difference between performative allyship versus I'm getting in here and I'm engaging in active, I call it clinical allyship.
Mm-hmm. It's really about listening, isn't it? Don't you think?
It is, which here again is kind of the odd piece, because we listen for a living, a lot of us in our clinical work, and it can be hard to hear what a person is saying. If I'm coming up with, like I said, I've had people come up with videos or something like that of something that was impactful for them, asking my opinion on it, and I've had to say I'm not in that space to see that particular film about Black teenagers dying or something like that. I just don't choose to watch that right now, because I got to go do clinical work and help somebody else get through that tomorrow. So the listening can be challenging, especially when we have in our heads that we're helping a person by showing them that. And then I think your discussion on responsibility, that's the accountability component of it. How can I acknowledge what my impact is?
We have to also consider ethics, don't you think? I mean, we've got to look at what the ethics are of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. You've got your pronouns up there, and so respecting that.
Mm-hmm. I think that ethics is usually one of the first things I bring up. I'm kind of surprised that our conversation didn't go there first, in a good way, because it's been organic. But I always bring up ethics in these conversations, especially if you've only got one shot with an organization. If this is the only video that you watch all year on DE&I, hear this one thing, that ethics in our field, APA tells us that we have to do better by people. They use big fancy words, we talk about beneficence and a lack of maleficence and things along those lines with our ethical principles. But really, this is about doing much more than I'm not going to do harm, that lack of maleficence. This is about actually doing good. And what that means is it's up to me to start normalizing. So when I'm meeting people, what are your personal pronouns, and here are mine, and things along those lines, just as an added thing that we go in to talk about, not using heavily gendered terms. Shania Twain quotes aside, I guess, but as I'm addressing rooms full of people, and just not assuming, when I speak to a person, what they're about or where they're coming from on a particular thing. And so that's me in my small way even if I'm only doing that in my circle of people that I interact with, of starting to normalize that, and ethically, that in the same way that we have any other continuing education, that's what we do here. We all had to make a shift. For those of us who maybe have been in the field a bit longer, back in 2013, when we went from DSM-4 TR to the new DSM-5, and we'll have to make a shift again, same kind of thing. So I don't know why there's so much pushback on this component of how we get this continuing education.
So we had an interesting piece of feedback from the conference, which was just a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the pieces of feedback, and we're going to employ it right away, is to have people's personal pronouns on their name tag.
Heck yeah.
And, why not? I mean, mm-hmm. that's really great feedback. So I love that. And I'm going to start including that on mine as well.
I love it. Yeah. We're in the school field where we're literally I'm surrounded by like the people that I read or that I look up to. I can reach out to to folks and say, like, I just read your article. Can we talk about that for a second? Like, what's your consultation fee? Can I afford you? And, a lot of times they're like, girl, get out of here. But being able to be receptive to feedback like that, that's the kicker. That's one of the ways that you're doing some of the work. Sure. That you have to be doing, because that's kind of the level one work. And then we start working up to the more complex questions and things along those lines. So a thing that I do is help people with their, clinical intake packets, and how sometimes that can be kind of sticky. I routinely see people who are seeking gender affirmation procedures, or working through orientation, or working through all types of things, right? Where their legal name might be very different from the name that they've chosen for themselves, that they feel happy and healthy with, and very different from, who can I say this name around? Who's safe in your life? Is that your parents? Is that your spouse? Is that, who is that, and what does that look like? And that is perhaps the ethicality piece that we're all more comfortable with, confidentiality, and what do I say to the insurance companies and your notes and things along those lines. But it all starts from there, an acknowledgement that not everyone is like me, and that they don't need protection and to be covered up with, a glass jar, but they need inclusion. They need to be around. And
so can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah.
When you're talking about an application packet and not putting just two genders on there. So what's a good way to do that so that you're getting the information? I'll just give you a real quick example. I'm a scout leader, and we have two types of troops, a boys troop and a girls troop. Mm-hmm. And when we do things where an identified girl needs to go to a girls troop, or identified guy goes to a guys troop, how do you not put on the form boy or girl? What are you putting instead?
One of the things that we used to think, which is still acceptable, is that we can add a number of different options. Do you identify? How do you identify? I think the nice, neater, cleaner way of doing that, where I'm not using my assumptions about what words feel safe or accurate for a person, is how do you identify your gender? : blank space. And now I'm letting that person say, I identify as a woman. Cool. Or I identify as a boy. And we always add on there, what's your name? What would you like me to call you? I think is another really important question I use every single intake I do. Because even if it's something as simple as, I see your name is Richard here, but you'd prefer to be called Dick. Okay, that's fine. Or Rich. That's fine. Not a problem. Right. That really helps. I also notice it in other ways that I wouldn't necessarily constitute as DE&I related. So having had people before with trauma histories where that name was what my abuser called me, and I no longer want to have that name. I never would have gotten that information just looking at their legal name. And so that tends to be a really cool, it's a closed-ended question in a lot of ways, but it opens up so many possibilities. So when I'm talking to folks, I always talk about the power of the colon and the blank space for things like orientation, things like gender, for things like, what do you want me to call you? how do you identify your personal pronouns? And here's another importance in the ethicality of the words that we use. Like preferred pronouns is not a phrase that we typically use anymore, right? These are our personal identifiers. And so it's our personal pronouns. I prefer the Green Bay Packers to win the next football game they have to play. That's what preference is, okay? I prefer them as a team, even though I recognize statistically they are not the best team. But my personal pronouns of what you call me, she, her, doctor, yeah, absolutely. And that tends to be the way that I think it's more effective to go about asking a person how they would like to be addressed and what feels safe for them.
That makes really good sense. Well, as we wind up our discussion today, are there any great reading lists that you have available or that you think people ought to seek out? Where can we find some good reading?
I love going to places that, like those organizations I brought up earlier, Association of Black Sexologists and Clinicians, they have their own journal as well. So taking a look at, after you're through reading the SASH journal, being able to look at other journals that are out there that have components specific to whatever marginalized community it is you're trying to get to. If you're going to be working a lot with trans identified folks or SOGI folks, take a look at some WPATH trainings. There's ample opportunities out there, I think, for us to really grow as clinicians and not only find like the academic side of things, but also being able to go even as simply as like an Amazon search of Black authors or trans authors or things along those lines across the board. If you're looking for fiction, if you're looking for any number of things, your children's books, those are especially important. I'd also be remiss to not remind folks when we're talking accountability and one's own discomfort, when we're going through DE&I conversations or being challenged in some way, respecting that people of color, for example, or any other group, have rights and abilities to create their own space, to have conversations. That can be kind of hard too. Yeah. Being able to start up affinity groups is routinely met with, well, why can't I be in it? What would happen if I created an all-white group? And those types of questions are the exact things that you can Google, because we've all had those conversations time and time and time again, and about why and how it's useful, and how in turn it is useful to have things like white accountability groups. So you can ask those questions like, what's the difference between Black and African American? I don't see the difference. And do we say that anymore? Is it okay to say this? Like, there are absolutely spaces that you can create to hold yourselves accountable and have those. The resources, are they in the right voice? I think is another piece that has come up for us in our discussion. And whose voice am I not hearing because the other one is so loud? So that's what I really appreciated about you.
Yeah. I really appreciate you saying to me too, that you are going to keep fighting, not fighting. You are going to keep encouraging and supporting SASH and getting programming that includes people of color, and that, we have that diversity within our own organization, people that are making decisions, that are providing our resources and our members and what have you, so that we are, as an organization, going down that path as well. It's important to me.
It's important to me too, because of all the lives that SASH touches, that we have an organization that's doing its best out there and growing and learning as the rest of us grow and learn. I routinely butcher a Maya Angelou quote, so I wrote it down so I wouldn't do that, but it's do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, you do better. That's the philosophy there. That's DE&I.
I love that. And I think that's a really great place for us to end our discussion today.
I'm not going to say anything more prolific than that. I can tell you right now. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to outdo that. So
I'm just so appreciative of you spending time with me today and just having this really candid and open conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and doing it with me. I'm just really grateful. So thanks for your time today. And Lauren, why don't you tell people where they can find you if they're interested in learning more about you and your practice?
Oh, hey, sure. So I am all up and through the socials. I'm an elder millennial now, so I have to say that. And that is at DrChappleLove. So at Dr ChappleLove, Chapel like the fruit, and then like going to the chapel, gonna get married. Or you can just simplify that and go drchappellove.com and see all the cool stuff I'm doing. I do a lot of speaking and training and all types of fun things, and research and kink related research and all those things. So
well, that's awesome. Thanks for spending time with us today. And
always.
we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Cool. Till next time.